I didn't cry when the funeral ended. People think grief arrives like a storm. Mine arrived like paperwork, sleeplessness, and two toddlers asking when their father was coming home. My twins were barely 3 when my husband died. For weeks, I moved through each day on instinct. Feed the kids, answer calls, sign forms. Pretend I understood what came next. I thought my parents would help. Not forever. Not financially. Just enough for me to catch my breath. I still remember sitting at their kitchen table after the funeral. My mother stirred her tea while I explained that I didn't know how I was going to manage everything alone. My father listened quietly. When I finished, he sighed. You need to learn to stand on your own feet. At first, I thought he misunderstood. I just need a little help with the twins, I said. My mother's expression tightened. We already raised our children. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. The memory lasted years. I drove home that evening feeling embarrassed for having asked. The next morning, my father-in-law called. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer advice. He simply said, pack what you need, bring the children. We'll figure the rest out together. That sentence changed my life. My in-laws weren't wealthy. They owned a modest horse ranch that had struggled for years. The house was old. The fences constantly needed repair. Some months felt impossible, but there was always room for us. My mother-in-law watched the twins when I worked. My father-in-law taught me things my husband used to handle himself. Neither of them treated me like a burden. When I cried, they sat with me. When I failed, they helped me start again. When I doubted myself, they reminded me that surviving one day at a time was still progress. The ranch became our shared project. At first, I worked because I had no choice. Later, I worked because I started believing it might actually succeed. Years passed. The twins grew. The ranch grew. What began as a struggling family operation slowly transformed into something larger. We expanded breeding programs, developed tourism experiences, acquired neighboring properties, and built partnerships I never would have imagined during those first desperate years. Success arrived gradually enough that I almost didn't notice it. Then one day, a major investment group approached us. The negotiations lasted months. When the final agreement was complete, the sale price exceeded $100 million. I stared at the number on the document for several seconds before speaking, not because of excitement, because I immediately thought about the people who had made that moment possible, the people who had opened their home when I had nowhere else to go, the people who had helped raise my children, the people who had chosen us. Word travels quickly when that kind of money is involved. A few weeks later, my parents called. The first conversation felt awkward. The second felt rehearsed. By the third, it was obvious they wanted a relationship again. Part of me wanted to be angry. Another part wanted to believe time had changed everything. So when they asked to attend a family gathering connected to the sale, I agreed. The event wasn't extravagant, just family members, advisors, attorneys, and a few longtime ranch employees. The atmosphere was warm until people began wondering how the proceeds would be distributed. My parents sat near the front. My father looked unusually confident. My mother smiled more than she had in years. I noticed both things. I said nothing. After everyone settled, one of the attorneys stepped forward and reviewed several finalized documents. Then he invited me to speak. I stood slowly. The room became quiet. I thanked employees. I thanked friends. I thanked the community that had supported the ranch. Then I looked toward my in-laws. My father-in-law appeared uncomfortable with the attention. My mother-in-law looked close to tears. For years, I said, people have congratulated me for what happened here. I paused. The truth is that I would have lost everything without two people sitting in this room. Neither of them moved. When my husband died, they gave my children a home. They gave me time to heal. They never asked for repayment. They never kept score. The room remained silent. I nodded toward the attorney. He opened another folder. Today, I continued, I want to acknowledge what they've done. The attorney explained the details. A substantial portion of the proceeds had already been transferred into trusts and assets established for my in-laws. Their retirement was secured. Their health care was secured. Their future was secured, not promised, secured. Everything had been finalized weeks earlier. My mother-in-law covered her mouth. My father-in-law looked completely speechless. Then I heard a sharp intake of breath from across the room. My parents. I glanced toward them. The expressions on their faces weren't anger. They weren't even shocked. They looked like people realizing a story they had been telling themselves no longer matched reality. For years, they had assumed family existed automatically. That blood guaranteed importance. That time would erase choices. But legal documents sitting on a conference table had just demonstrated something else. Trust had been built elsewhere, not purchased, not inherited. Built, nobody argued, nobody raised their voice. The attorney continued reviewing paperwork. The meeting moved forward, yet the atmosphere had changed. The shift felt permanent. Afterward, guests began leaving. My parents approached me near the doorway. For a moment, none of us spoke. My mother looked older than I remembered. My father seemed uncertain. Finally, he said, "You really meant all of that?" It wasn't a question. I nodded. Yes, another silence followed. Then my mother quietly asked, "Were we that disappointing?" The question hurt more than I expected because for the first time it sounded sincere. I thought about answering quickly. Instead, I told the truth. I needed family. Neither of them looked away, and they were there. No accusation, no speech, just a fact. My parents left shortly afterward, not dramatically, not angrily, just quietly. I watched them walk to their car. For the first time in years, I felt neither bitterness nor satisfaction, only clarity. Later that evening, my in-laws sat on the porch, watching the sunset with the twins, who weren't twins anymore. But young adults preparing for lives of their own. The ranch was gone, the chapter was over, yet somehow everything that mattered remained. Sat beside them and listened to the familiar sound of laughter drifting across the yard. My husband wasn't there to see any of it. I still wished he was. Some losses never stop hurting, but as I looked around that porch, I understood something grief had taken years to teach me. Family isn't defined by who could have helped, it's defined by who did, and sometimes the people who save your life are the ones who simply open the door and say, "Come in." Everything else grows from there.